Good morning, friends, and welcome back to the Homesteading Housewife. I am Monica, for those of you that are new to my channel, and it was brought to my attention recently that I do not have a how to make your own sourdough starter video. Now, I do have a couple recipes on my channel, but I have so many more I am wanting to share with you. So I decided to make this a 3-part little mini series on how to make your own sourdough and kind of a sourdough 101 to answer all the questions. Plus, if there are enough questions down in the comments section, I'll just do a Q&A. But the way the videos are going to go, we're going to have the first video, that is today's video, and that is how to make your sourdough starter. And then at the end, I will give you tips and tricks on keeping it alive, as well as storage and how to test it to see if it is ready to actually make your first loaf of sourdough bread. The second video is going to be techniques, equipment needed to make your own bread versus equipment that's more just a luxury and not really needed for those that are trying to do it on a budget like I was. And then the last video is actually going to be my master sourdough bread recipe. And all that means, because you see that phrase thrown around a lot, it is my go-to bread loaf that I make almost every single day. But you can easily change just a couple ingredients and then it can be all sorts of different loaves. Exactly like the bread loaf that I make for our everyday sandwich bread. With just a couple ingredients switched or added, then it turns into many different loaves. So that is all that means if you don't know. So let's get started on making some sourdough starter. Okay, so to make your starter, you just need a glass, and then you want to zero out the glass on your scale to 0, and then you want it in grams. And so to start off, we are going to be doing 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour. So we'll do the water first. Okay, and that's fine. And then you want to zero out again, and then we want 60 grams of flour. Now, when it comes to flour, you can make this starter with any type of wheat flour. I do not know about gluten-free. I know it's out there. I have never tried it, and I would not have good information. I would be Googling it just like you would, trying to find my answers. What I have here, it's in my little container that goes with my food mill. I just have hard white wheat. Whenever you're picking the flour you want to use, the stronger the flour, the stronger and more active your sourdough is going to be in a shorter amount of time. So if you're using all-purpose flour just from the store, it's going to work. It just may take a couple more days for you to get to the activity level as someone that is using a fresh milled flour. So I just have a hard white. I would not advise, if you do mill your own flour, I advise not using a soft white wheat. So it's lower in gluten, so it's not going to do as well as far as making a nice, strong sourdough bread and starter. Whichever store-bought, all-purpose, fresh milled, red, white, however you're wanting to do it, you want 60 grams. Okay. And then I like using just a wooden spoon, but you just want to take it. We don't even need the scale anymore. And just stir everything together. And just make sure there aren't any dry spots. And that is all there is to it. So mine is going to look slightly different in texture compared to someone that would be using an all-purpose flour. So if you're using that and yours doesn't look exactly like mine, that is okay. If you did 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour, then it's good to go. So stir it up, make sure there's no dry spots, and then you just want to set something on top of it. This can be the lid, and you can see I'm not doing any type of screwing. It's just sitting on there to make sure nothing gets in the jar. You can also use like cheesecloth on top with a rubber band, paper towel, coffee filter, anything that's going to let this breathe, gather wild yeast from the air, and start fermenting is going to be good to go. You just don't want to crank anything down because then you're not going to get your desired result. Now, one thing that I like to do whenever I'm making a new sourdough is to put a rubber band of some sort where the line is. So right here is where our sourdough is essentially. So that will stay there. And that way, once this starts activating and fermenting, we'll be able to actually see how much it's growing from day to day. So this is going to sit untouched on our counter for 24 hours. After 24 hours, I will bring you back and we will work on it for day 2 of sourdough start. So on day 2, you are not going to see really anything going on. Like, it's just going to look kind of like it did yesterday. You may see a bubble or two, but most likely it's not going to do anything, and that is perfectly fine. So it's been 24 hours. So all we're going to do is put it on our scale, zero it out with it on, and add 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour again. Okay, and then take it off your scale. We're just going to stir it up. Make sure you're scraping down the sides and getting everything mixed in well. So now, put our lid back on, and again, it's just sitting. And then we'll take our little rubber band and just make sure it's sitting. That way, if anything does start happening, we'll be able to tell. And that is day 2. We are on day 3, and we have some stuff to look at. So you can see all these bubbles. That is where our flour is starting to ferment. There's still not a ton, but you can see we did get a little over. And the smell is starting to smell like sourdough, which is what you want. Take a jar, because we want to save our discard. And you want to discard about half. And there are so many recipes to use the discard in. And you just pop the jar in your fridge. Okay, so we added our 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour to our jar. Now we're going to get this all stirred up again, put our lid back on, make sure we move our rubber band, and now this is going to sit on our counter for another 24 hours. And that's day 3. Okay, so here is our sourdough after 12 hours, and you can see that it has doubled in size almost. We have a lot of bubbles, a lot of action going on. It smells amazing. So at this point, you are ready to start doing a repetitive process through day 6. So today, day 4, day 5, and day 6, all we're going to do is the exact same thing we did this morning. We will discard half, feed it, and let it sit all day. So I will bring you back on day 7. All right, so this is day 7. And so we have been doing the same thing of discarding half and feeding it. And you can see this is from last night's feeding. And it is nice, active, it doubled, and it smells just like some yummy sourdough. So now I'm going to show you how to see if your sourdough is ready to bake with. Now, this isn't going to necessarily mean that it's going to be super strong. It's going to take time, and that's just going to be to continually be using it, and you're going to make it stronger and stronger and stronger. So this trick I'm getting ready to show you is not only great for if you're just making a starter and you want to see if it's ready to bake with, but this is also great if say you feed your starter and then you forget about it and you see it's already deflating, which means it's eaten through everything and it's just starting to go back down and become not active. You can do this trick to see if it's still active enough to make bread with, or if you need to start the process over and feed it again. So let me show you. Okay, I'm going to be making bread, so we're going to go ahead and measure out our water first. But you could also just do a little bit of water in a bowl and then just like a scoop of sourdough if you wanted to go that route. But since I'm going to be baking anyway, I'm just going to do it this way. And then you just take some sourdough starter. And all we're wanting to see is if it floats. And you can see that this is floating very nicely. And there you go. That's how you can tell if it is ready or not. If it sinks to the bottom, then it's either not ready to make bread with or it's not active enough anymore. But this is perfect. Nice, fluffy, and sits right on top of the water. Okay, so first let's talk about storage. This is all going to depend on how you like to bake. So if you're going to be baking every day, every other day, it's going to look different than someone that only wants to bake a couple times a week or a couple times a month. So if you are only wanting to bake every now and then you would keep your sourdough starter in your fridge. You would feed it and then put it in your fridge, and then the next time you wanted to make bread, you would take this out the day before and let it come up to room temperature, and then you would feed it with, I would discard half. The way that I keep my sourdough, I would discard half of it and then feed it and let it become active. Depending on how long it was in the fridge, it may take 1 to 2 feedings to get it back to a good active consistency. Mostly mine just takes a day or so, but if I'm using a really old discard that I'm trying to reactivate, then it usually takes a couple days. So just keep that in mind if you are going to be keeping it more dormant in your fridge, that it will give it a couple days. It'll take it a couple days to get back to what it was. Now, the way that I keep my starter may be different than the way you keep your starter or the way other people keep their starters. So some people have their jar that's their starter, and it's just a tiny jar and they feed a little bit of it every day. And then whenever they want to make bread or some sort of sourdough, they will get a bigger jar, fill it with a certain amount of flour and water that will be the amount that they need in their recipe, like say 100 grams. They'll make sure that they have 100 grams worth of stuff, and then they'll add just a couple tablespoons of their starter in there, and then feed their other little starter because you took a little bit out of it. I don't do that. I have one jar way that I do it, which is the way I'm going to describe for the avid baker that wants to bake every day to every other day. This sits out on my counter. So it is always at some sort of active-ish state. I will feed it either in the mornings or evenings, and depending on how much I bake, sometimes I feed it twice a day. But we'll just say once a day in the mornings. So I will open this up, I will discard half of it, and that goes in the fridge for when I want to use all my sourdough discard for yummy recipes, which I have plenty that I can share with you. And then I feed this same jar. So there, when I like if I were to discard half, it's risen up to here. So I would have this much left, and then I would feed this, the whole amount, until it's the consistency that I like. And the reason I like doing this is I have a larger family, and sometimes I want to make more than one loaf of bread. So if I was doing it in a measured way, I'm not always going to have the right amount. But if I'm using a quart jar or like the pickle jar that we were using, then I'm going to be able to fill it to where it has the right consistency. So if I know that I want to make 3 loaves of bread, for instance, I'm going to feed it more flour and get it to the consistency that it needs to be for being a starter and to get active. If I'm only wanting to feed it, I'll just feed it enough to feed the wild yeast that's in there, the starter, and then it's good to go. And that's just what works for me. If you want to measure it out every single time, go for it. Just know that sourdough is very forgiving, and so you don't always have to measure whenever you're feeding your starter. I did it in the beginning just to get used to it and to know what to look for on the right consistency. But once you get that consistency down, you don't need to worry about it anymore. So besides proper storage, you need to make sure you are feeding your sourdough the amount it needs to eat. And people say all the time that it is so hard to kill a sourdough starter. Let me tell you, I have killed many sourdough starters. Many. And it is all due to one reason and one reason only. I was not feeding it the proper amount. Now, when we talk about discarding half, you're not actually throwing that away. We are keeping it, and we will put it in additional recipes. But I didn't know about that when I first started wanting to make sourdough years ago. So I was just keeping it all in the jar. I wasn't discarding half. So what was happening is you got to think of your yeast, your wild yeast that's in here. Think of it as little yeast people. So you have your little yeast village down in the bottom of your jar. And when you feed it, like your small amount of yeast people, when you feed it the 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour, that is enough to feed your tiny yeast people. But if you're not discarding half, and then so you start off day one with this much starter after you feed it. And then so day 2, you're up to here in the amount of starter, and you don't discard. But then you feed it the same amount for this amount of people. Your yeast people, okay, your yeast people are gonna starve and die off. That's the best way I can describe it, is if you aren't wanting to say discard every time and you're wanting to keep your sourdough all in the same jar, you need to make sure you are feeding your yeast people enough food. Because if you're not, your sourdough is going to die because you're going to be starving it. Which leads me to a couple different ways you can see if your sourdough is hungry. One is going to be the smell. If you, say you forgot to feed it for a day or even 2 days, because again, sourdough is forgiving. If you forget to feed it for a couple days and then you see it on the counter, you're like, oh no, I never fed my starter. That is okay. But you're going to notice when you open up that jar, it's going to smell like alcohol. And that is telling you, hey man, I'm hungry. Feed me. The other thing you will see is hooch, which is just some like grayish liquid that'll come to the top of your starter. It is not bad. Some people mix it in, some people just drain it off, but it's just another thing to show you that it's hungry. It's saying, hey, I'm hungry, feed me. So the alcohol smell and hooch forming are just forms of your sourdough speaking to you saying, hey, I'm still here, feed me. So again, just to recap, the number one way you can kill your starter is by not feeding it the proper amount. So if you are not discarding regularly, or you're wanting to keep a larger amount, just make sure you're feeding it enough. Now, I don't have actual measurements because you can really tell by your texture, but say you use 60 grams for this amount, and now you have this amount, then you want to double that amount. Same with here. So you want to triple that original amount, and you'll do just fine. So that is the end of the first of our Sourdough 101 series. I really hope this answers some questions, and I hope you get started on this. And I would love to see pictures of your progress. If you have Instagram or Facebook, tag me in them. I am not really active on Facebook, but I do check it once a week. I am, however, active on Instagram daily. So I would love to see what you have going on with your sourdough journey. And I will see you all tomorrow for the second part of Sourdough 101.